Here's a question I think we need to ask ourselves. Where are we still clinging to systems of control, legalism, exclusion, and convincing ourselves that this is faithfulness? And that's not just a hypothetical question, because if the Jesus that we meet in the Gospels walked into those systems today, how do you think he would react? Honestly, there's a good chance he might have a problem with our systems. What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putthoff, and this is scene 9 of the JesusX30 challenge, a 30-day discipleship journey walking through the life of Jesus, following the chronological outline of my 3-volume book project, Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 volumes are out now in print and ebook. Get your copy anywhere you buy your books or borrow them and follow along. This scene 9, takes us into Jesus' second Passover since going public with his messianic campaign. And this one is going to spark a storm that's going to keep building until it reaches the cross in approximately a year from now. It's spring of 28 AD. For the past year, Jesus has been making waves up north in the Galilee, running his campaign headquarters out of Capernaum, as we've discussed. But now he's headed south to Judea for Passover, one of the 3 major pilgrimage festivals. And just to clarify, when we say pilgrims, we're not talking about the kind with buckled hats from American history books. Okay? These were Jewish men and women and children traveling from all over the Roman Empire to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. And the trip from the Galilee to Jerusalem wasn't a small stroll. It was about 80 miles on foot for Jesus and his disciples. That's a few days, 4 or 5 days of travel, moving through Samaria or jumping the Jordan River and going east and then jumping back to the west once you get near Jerusalem and avoiding Samaria. And finally, climbing the steep road into Jerusalem. So Passover itself was more than a holiday. It was Israel's foundational liberation story. It's the celebration of God delivering his people from Egypt. Every year, pilgrims would come not just to remember the past, but to pray that this would be the year that God would send a new deliverer. And as we noted back in an earlier scene where Jesus struck the temple for the first time, Passover had a way of stirring up revolutionary energy. If you wanted your message heard, this was the time to show up. And Jesus wasn't the first to know it. Other would-be messiahs and revolutionaries and insurgents in the first century around the time of Jesus timed their own movements to coincide with this particular feast, hoping to ignite popular support right when national hopes were at their peak. It's like showing up to the capital city during a national holiday when all the TV cameras are rolling, every major politician is in town, and the streets are packed with people chanting about freedom. You can imagine the tension and how quickly things could explode. That's the atmosphere Jesus walks into when he performs a public healing on the Sabbath, right in the city, just outside the temple, and he knows exactly what it's going to trigger. In John 5, the scene opens at the Pool of Bethesda. In Jesus' day, it was a large stepped pool fed by an underground spring near the sheep gate on the north side of the temple complex. The place carried a reputation. From time to time, the waters would stir, and many believed an angel caused the stirring, and that the first person into the pool after the stirring began would be healed. So you can picture it. The pool is surrounded by people who are sick and blind and paralyzed, and all of them are waiting for and watching the water, waiting for it to stir. And for someone who can't walk, it's almost cruel. It's like setting up a race that they're not ever going to win. I think the Chosen series actually does a good job of showing the frustration and just the hopelessness surrounding this scene. And Jesus walks up to a man at the Pool of Bethesda who'd been unable to walk for 38 years. That's longer than most people lived in Jesus' day. And without any ceremony, and we're in John 5, Jesus looks at him and he says, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And the man does. And here's what's interesting about this encounter. In other healings, people come to Jesus, they cry out to him, and they reach for his cloak. They send messengers ahead of them to say, "Hey, we need you to help back in another city." But not here. This man never actually asks Jesus for healing. In fact, when Jesus first asks him if he wants to get well, his answer is basically, I can't. Someone always beats me to the water. His hope is still in the pool. It's not in Jesus. Jesus's reputation has spread by this point. People know he's a healer. And this man doesn't seem to have any reason to believe that Jesus is going to heal him or capable of healing him yet. But Jesus does. And even after the healing, another interesting bit, John tells us he doesn't know who Jesus is. Jesus had slipped away into the crowd. Later, Jesus finds him again and warns him, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. John 5:14. And that's a pretty strong warning. One Jesus doesn't give very often. And when the man learns that it was Jesus who healed him, he goes and tells the religious leaders. And whether that was gratitude or betrayal, we're not sure. But it's hard not to notice that this man isn't portrayed as kind of the model disciple. And maybe that's part of the point. Jesus doesn't only heal people who will later follow him, right? Sometimes he heals knowing full well they might not. And in this case, I can't help but think Jesus knew this man would talk, which would get the attention of the authorities and his opponents faster. And that's exactly what happens. The leaders aren't celebrating, they're furious. Not just because Jesus healed, but because he told the man to pick up his mat, a direct violation of their Sabbath regulations. So when they confront Jesus, Jesus responds, my Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. In Jesus' world, that's a claim to be working alongside God and sharing in his authority. And they don't miss the implication. John tells us that at this moment, they actually begin plotting to kill him. It's not just about breaking a Sabbath rule. It's about Jesus challenging the entire religious and social and theological and political and economic framework that gave them power. And instead of backing down, Jesus doubles down, launches into a teaching moment in which he claims divine authority, the right to judge, the right to receive the same honor as the Father himself. In a culture built on honor, we've talked about this, honor and shame. What Jesus is doing and saying here is not just blasphemy in a modern sense of claiming to be God. It's a direct strike at the heart of the system that he's coming against. It wasn't just the healing at Bethesda that set off alarms either. Okay? There's a lot more going on in this scene. Go check out the scene in the books. But a little later, Jesus and his disciples are walking through grain fields on the Sabbath. And they're hungry, so they pluck some heads of grain, they rub them in their hands, and they eat. It seems harmless enough, right? Farmers in the Torah were told to leave the edges of their fields for travelers and the poor to eat from. Okay, that's Leviticus 19, 9 to 10. But the religious leaders saw something else. What they saw was working on the Sabbath. The picking and the prepping in the hands of the food and eating, that was considered work, according to their interpretation in this moment. And to them, that wasn't just a minor offense. It was a violation of one of the defining markers of covenant faithfulness. And they call it to Jesus. Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus answers by pointing back to King David and pointing out how King David actually ate the consecrated bread in the tabernacle when he and his men were hungry. Then he drops a line that really reframes this whole conversation. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Mark 2. For them, that was a little staggering. The Sabbath wasn't just a day off, it was divine institution. It's part of the very identity of God's people, a covenant gift from God. And it was guarded fiercely for over 1,000 years. And here's Jesus saying, in effect, I have authority over it. So that's not just a little theological statement about Jesus's identity. That's a political shot at his opponents. He's claiming authority that outranks their most sacred tradition. And it was like saying, you don't get to define faithfulness anymore. I do. You don't get to define holiness anymore. I do. In their eyes, that wasn't just bad teaching. It was a dangerous redefinition of power. And this is the moment where I think you can start to see in the arc of Jesus's messianic campaign, this is a moment where the tension becomes irreversible. Up to now, Jesus' biggest controversies had been in the Galilee. He'd gained a reputation for teaching with authority, performing healings, and even making disruptive moves in synagogues. But he was still operating on his home turf, right? And he had some allies that we've talked about. He had built a network where he was, in a lot of ways, protected, at least momentarily, to operate the way he's been operating. And he was doing so in the Galilee, where revolutionary talk found sympathetic ears. As we've talked about, the Galilee had a history of pushing back against Rome. It was full of people longing for change and longing for revolution. But now he's in Jerusalem during Passover in full view of the temple establishment. And he uses this moment not to keep a low profile, but to heal publicly on the Sabbath, to tell a man to break one of the Sabbath carrying rules, to claim divine authority, to work alongside the Father, and to announce himself as Lord of the Sabbath. So this wasn't clumsiness or bad timing. This was a deliberate move on the part of Jesus, strategic. On one level, he's making a theological point. The God laws are meant for human good, not as tools to control or exclude or harm other humans. But on another level, he's strategically escalating the conflict. Because the empire of God, the kingdom of God, was never going to arrive by quietly navigating around in these broken systems. It was going to arrive by confronting them head on, by confronting earthly empires face to face. And that meant forcing the question, who really speaks for God? Who really represents God? Is it the elite who have long been recognized and strong-armed their people to recognize them as the go-betweens between God and humanity, the representatives of what God is and who he favors and what he looks like? Is it the elite? Or is it this carpenter from Galilee who likes to teach and who heals the oppressed and restores the excluded and has parties with the wild crowd and hangs out with prostitutes? Which one really speaks for God? That's the question Jesus is forcing everyone around him to ask. And he wasn't just interpreting the Sabbath differently at this point. He was announcing that he had the authority to redefine it. In Jesus' world, that meant a shift in who held the keys to spiritual legitimacy. And for the powers that be, that was intolerable. Sometimes following Jesus means walking into tension instead of away from it. Jesus didn't just come to comfort individuals. He did come to comfort individuals, in particular, those who've been pressed down. But he also came to dismantle the systems that continue to keep people crushed. Okay, hear that. This is important. Jesus didn't just come to lift up those who are being pressed down. Jesus came to dismantle any social and economic and political and religious or theological system or institution or gathering or building or group of people that keeps those people down perpetually and prevents them from rising up. And that means some waters are going to get stirred. So here's the question we started with. Where are we? Where are you? Where am I still clinging to systems of control or legalism or exclusion and calling it faithfulness? If Jesus walked into the spaces we inhabit, the spaces we're protecting, the spaces we've claimed as holy for God, how would he respond? I would step out on a limb and venture to guess that he might overturn the entire thing. I think that's the heart of discipleship. It's not just about being a believer who benefits from Jesus' work, but it's about being a follower who joins him in confronting the forces that misuse God's word to harm people. The man at the pool received Jesus' healing, but he did not follow Jesus. He treated Jesus as a means to an end. He accepted his help. He believed something about Jesus, but he didn't follow it. Here's the other thing. Jesus healed him anyway, because that's what Jesus does. He doesn't only heal and care for those who are perfectly loyal to him, which I think is a lesson that many of us need to keep in mind. When it comes to our own role in this kingdom, we need to recognize that true discipleship means that we take the healing, the forgiveness, the grace that we've received, that we sing about, that we celebrate, that we ourselves proudly embrace, because that's what God's given to us. And we take all of that and we walk with Jesus into the storm, where we bring that same healing and forgiveness and grace and mercy to others, regardless of who they are, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of their politics, regardless of their identity or sexuality, regardless of whether or not they're believers in or followers of Jesus. Jesus doesn't put qualifications, he takes it to anyone who needs it. And I have to ask myself this constantly. Am I willing to lay my traditions, my theological assumptions, my political leanings, and my social comfort on the table and ask, does this reflect the heart of God? Or am I protecting something, some version of God, some version of God's holiness that Jesus himself would challenge? I heard a story about a group who went on a short-term mission trip overseas. They came from a small town church where everybody knows each other's last names. Casseroles are sort of a love language, right? And the Sunday morning bulletin hasn't changed font since the 80s. And they'd been fundraising for months, packing boxes of donated clothes, Bibles, teaching materials. And now they were finally headed to go out and bless a congregation in a lesser developed country around the world. So when they landed, they were tired, jet lagged, and completely not ready for what they found. So their lodging plans had fallen through, their food supply got stuck in customs, and suddenly what they find is that the local church in the country that they were going to minister to, the very people that they thought they were going to go and bless and serve and lift up, that local group actually began scrambling to make room for all of them. So all of a sudden, instead of arriving as these rescuers, the heroes, the American Christians were the ones who realized very quickly they were the ones in need of help. And without hesitation, the families that these Americans came to witness to actually became the ministers. But not in a preachy, talky way, right? They didn't greet the American Christians on a mission trip at the gate and start telling them about Jesus. They didn't witness to them. They didn't evangelize them in that sense. What they ended up do is they extended a hand. Families in the local communities opened up their homes. People gave them their own beds and ended up sleeping on the floors of their homes so that these missionaries could have their own beds. Meals appeared out of kitchens that didn't have much in them to begin with. And there was no talk whatsoever about making sure to keep these Americans at arm's length because they're outsiders or because they have a different way of doing things. These poverty-stricken followers of Jesus in an underdeveloped nation that's been squashed by developed nations economically and politically and socially, and looked down upon by American Christians as sort of somehow less faithful to Jesus because they don't do things the way we do. These poverty-stricken followers of Jesus in this underdeveloped nation cared for these American Christians with joy, with open-handedness, with the kind of hospitality you can't fake, and the kind of hospitality that seeks nothing in return. Somewhere in that week, the Americans realized that their world, their faith, their idea of what following Jesus should look like had been flipped upside down. They had come thinking they'd teach these people what faithfulness looked like. They were going to show them how to grow their churches the way we do here in the States. But instead, they'd been shown what Jesus looks like, not as a sermon, not through evangelism, not through judgment, but just in the way that they lived. And when these Americans got back to their home church in the States, they couldn't shake it, at least the core group. They started asking questions about who was welcome at their table, about whether their own potlucks and small groups and worship services reflected the open doors and just the genuine love and hospitality that they'd experienced abroad. And this group in particular started making changes, inviting in some of the immigrant families from their own town that they'd previously kept at arm's length. Because as one of the men admits to have said before that moment, if they want to live here, they should act more like us. That dude had a change of heart, and he actually became a leader among this group, leading others in the congregation in rearranging programs to make space for people who didn't fit that usual mold. And he even helped to rethink how they handled their money so that they could meet real needs instead of just funding more church projects. And you better believe that not everyone in the church congregation liked it, not at all. Some of the people in the congregation got really uncomfortable really fast. We're losing who we are. We just can't change everything. That's not how we've always done things. And someone recalls actually asking, isn't this why we have a missions budget? So we can go witness to them, but still do church the way we do? A few families left, which was a big deal in this setting because this was not a big church to begin with. The group, though, that had gone overseas, they couldn't just go back to just believing in Jesus and letting him save them. Not after seeing what actually following Jesus looked like in the people that they had encountered on their own mission trip. They'd been confronted with the choice every disciple, I think, needs to face, but so many of us never ask. Do I stay safe inside the old rules? Or do I step into the storm with Jesus? The question of believing versus following, of asking whether or not I'm protecting people from policies and systems that have been used to harm others, or whether I'm protecting those policies and systems because, well, that's what I've always known, that's how we've always done things. These aren't easy questions. It's far simpler to hold on to the rules we're comfortable with or the structures we've always known. But Jesus isn't calling us to comfort. He's calling us to liberation. For those still on the margins, for those still being pushed down, and also for ourselves. It's kind of interesting at the same time that Jesus is calling you and me to protect others and to set others free of our own bad interpretations or biblical traditions or church traditions. He's also trying to point out to us that this liberation, this freedom that he calls us to extend to others and that he's given to us, it's also for us. What started here in scene 9 as a quiet healing in a crowded city turned into a public confrontation that the elite of Jerusalem in the spring of 28 AD couldn't ignore. Jesus wasn't just breaking rules, he was reclaiming God's authority from those who had twisted it into a tool of oppression. And from this point, there's no turning back. Lekul Mad, go and learn and come back for scene 10 of the JesusX30 challenge.